I still remember the sound of the ocean that morning, quiet but endless, brushing against the frozen shore behind my father's house in Camden. The air smelled of salt and cold metal, the kind of winter scent that could make anyone feel small. I had just opened the fridge to take out a slice of cake I'd bought the night before, the same kind he used to eat every November, a small way of keeping him close. The house was still only the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock he left behind. Then I heard the sharp click of heels behind me. Samantha's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, and young, and full of that strange pride she carried everywhere. "That's my cake," she said, as if ownership were something she could claim simply by tone. "You never ask before touching anything." I turned confused. My hand still held the plate. I wanted to say it was mine, that I had paid for it, but before the words formed, her hand struck across my cheek. The sound cracked through the kitchen louder than the ocean outside. For a second, I didn't feel pain, just shock. I stared at her, the red wool of her sweater, the phone in her other hand still recording for a live stream, the look of satisfaction that chilled me deeper than the slap. From the hallway came the slow creak of footsteps. Linda, my stepmother, appeared in her gray robe, face calm as if nothing had happened. "Greedy girls end up alone," she said. Her words landed harder than the slap. The kitchen seemed to shrink. The clock on the wall fell and shattered, scattering glass near my feet. I remember thinking how fragile time sounded when it broke. I didn't speak. The air felt heavy. My cheek burned, my throat locked. For years I had swallowed smaller insults thinking silence was peace. But that morning something inside me shifted. I looked at them, two women who had turned my father's home into a stage for cruelty, and I realized I didn't owe them my stillness anymore. My hand moved slowly to the doorknob. The metal was cold against my skin, grounding me. I opened the front door. Wind rushed in, carrying the smell of the sea and pine. Samantha's phone wavered in her hand, the camera catching the moment. Linda's expression flickered a faint hint of surprise beneath her calm mask. My voice came out low but steady. "Then you can both start learning what alone really feels like." For a moment, no one moved. The cold crept into the room, wrapping around us. I saw a strand of my father's handwriting still taped to the fridge, a list that ended with the word "forgive." I didn't feel forgiveness. Not yet. What I felt was release. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It wasn't fear. It was freedom. They stepped back, maybe because they saw something new in my eyes, something that didn't belong to the girl who had kept quiet all year. I stood there, the wind on my face, the taste of salt in the air, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt alive. Sometimes breaking happens quietly, but the echo can fill a lifetime. If you've ever reached that point where calm becomes your rebellion, tell me, what would you have done? It had been a year since my father's heart stopped on that cold November morning in 2024. Camden had already gone quiet for the season. The harbor was frozen in patches, boats tied tight against the docks, and seagulls circled like they were looking for something that wasn't there anymore. I stayed in the house because I couldn't imagine anyone else keeping it warm. The old pine floors still creaked in the same rhythm as when he walked across them every morning for coffee. His jacket still hung by the door, and sometimes I caught myself turning toward the hallway, expecting to hear him hum under his breath. When Linda called to say their house in Rockland was being renovated, I didn't hesitate. "Of course you can stay here," I told her. It felt like the right thing to do. Family should stay together. That's what he always said. She arrived 2 weeks before Christmas with Samantha in tow, their car filled with boxes and scented candles and too many words. At first it was fine. The laughter sounded strange, but not unwelcome, and the house didn't feel as hollow. Linda cooked for a few days, filling the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and butter. She said she wanted to help me through the first year without him. I believed her. It was only later that I realized what kind of help she meant. By January, she had changed the curtains from my father's navy blue to her own floral prints. She sold his old armchair to make space. When I came home from work one evening and saw the empty spot where his chair used to be, I told myself it was just furniture. I kept telling myself that for months. Samantha treated the house like a set she was filming on. She moved from room to room, taking pictures for her followers, using my father's study as a background for her fashion posts. "This lighting is perfect," she said, not even looking at me. I didn't say anything then either. Some part of me thought silence would protect what was left of him, that if I avoided conflict, the house would stay intact. But silence has a way of feeding the wrong people. By spring, they began rearranging things without asking. My father's photo from his Coast Guard days disappeared from the mantel. In its place sat a porcelain angel Linda said brought her luck. The neighbors noticed before I did. Mrs. Peters stopped me by the mailbox one morning. "Your stepmother is quite the decorator," she said with a smile that meant more than it said. I smiled back, the polite kind that doesn't reach the eyes. When summer came, they threw a barbecue and invited their friends from Rockland. I spent most of the day washing dishes in the kitchen while they laughed on the deck. Every time I looked out the window, I saw someone sitting in my father's chair drinking his bourbon, talking about how lucky Linda was to have such a house by the sea. Later that night, when I gathered the plates, I found one of the guests had set their glass on the flag case that held my father's folded stars and stripes. I moved it quietly, wiped the ring of condensation away, and went to bed without saying a word. By fall, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Samantha called the guest room her room. Linda talked about repainting the walls and replacing the porch light. She even told the electrician my husband built this house with his bare hands, and the words stung like salt on an open wound. I wanted to correct her to say my father's name aloud in that sentence, but my mouth stayed closed. "The day she sold his tool set at a yard sale because we don't need old things lying around." I didn't stop her. I just walked inside and stared out at the gray Atlantic, counting waves, until the anger softened into something that looked like calm. That winter arrived early, carrying the smell of snow, before the first flake even touched the ground. The house was colder no matter how high I turned the heat. At dinner, the three of us sat at the table, the same one my father had built from reclaimed wood. The only sound was the scrape of forks and the slow drip of the kitchen faucet. The light above us flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like strangers' hands. Linda ate in silence, glancing at me only when she wanted the salt. Samantha scrolled through her phone, the blue glow of the screen painting her face in colors that didn't belong in this house. I looked at them and realized how far gone everything was. The warmth had left the walls, the voices, the air. I tried to picture what my father would have said if he could see this dinner, this awkward ceremony of people pretending to be family. He would have told me that kindness doesn't mean surrender. That night after they went to bed, I walked through the house with the lights off. The moonlight spilled through the windows, tracing outlines of furniture that no longer felt like ours. In the living room, I stopped by the empty space where his armchair had once been and whispered, "I'm still here, Dad." My voice broke a little, but I didn't cry. The next morning, I made coffee in his old mug, the one thing they hadn't touched yet. It was chipped along the rim, but it still held warmth. As I stood by the window watching the snow start to fall over the bay, I promised myself something I didn't yet understand. I would endure, but not forever. By January, the snow had built up in small ridges along the porch rail, and every morning I brushed it away just to see the wood beneath. It felt like a ritual, a way of keeping something of my father's clean. Inside the house, the air had changed. The smell of Linda's perfume lingered everywhere, heavy and floral, mixing with the salt air that slipped through the window frames. One night, while I was folding laundry, I heard Samantha laugh from the hallway. "Clara, can you bring this to my room when you're done?" "You're better at folding." She said it like a joke, but didn't wait for me to laugh. The next morning, Linda called from the kitchen. "Clara, did you feed the cat?" I didn't correct her that it wasn't my job or that the cat wasn't mine. They had started speaking to me like I was the help. A few days later, I overheard Samantha on a call with a friend. "Yeah, I'm still at my stepdad's place. It's basically ours now. The tenant, Clara. She's quiet, never complains." Tenant. The word hung in the air, cold and wrong. I was standing right outside her door, holding a basket of clean towels I had washed because I couldn't stand the smell of mildew spreading in the laundry room. I could have walked in, told her off, demanded respect. Instead, I set the towels on the banister and walked away. I went to my father's study, closed the door, and stared at the bookshelf he built with his own hands. His letters were still in the bottom drawer, written in his small, careful handwriting full of plans and hopes he never finished. I pulled one out, the edges yellowing, and read his words again. "You'll make this place your own someday." I folded it back carefully, but when I went to return it, I noticed something was missing. The envelope marked "Insurance" was gone. I searched the drawer twice before I found the torn paper in the wastebasket beside Samantha's room. She had been cutting old papers for scrapbooking. My father's signature was split in half, his handwriting turned into decoration. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, trying to find anger strong enough to act. But the only thing I felt was exhaustion. When you've spent months walking on glass, even standing still feels like breaking something. A week later, Linda hosted her book club in the living room. I stayed in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes, but the walls were thin. "This house wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for my husband," she said. The women murmured agreement, their voices polite but uncertain. Through the window above the sink, I could see their reflections. Linda's hand gesturing grandly toward the shelves my father built, the beams he sanded until they shone. My hand trembled so hard the plate slipped and cracked in two. The sound made them all turn. "Oh, Clara," Linda said, her smile stiff. "You're always so nervous." I gathered the pieces, my fingers shaking a tiny cut blooming red on my thumb. "Sorry," I whispered. No one answered. Later that evening, I went outside to dump the trash. The cold wind cut across my face, sharp and briny. Behind me, I could still hear their laughter through the walls. I stood by the fence and breathed until the sting in my chest settled into something dull. Sometimes silence feels safer than truth. I told myself that over and over. In a town like Camden, gossip traveled faster than the tide. If I spoke, I would be the ungrateful one, the emotional stepdaughter, the difficult woman. I couldn't let that be the version they spread of me. But silence has a cost. Each day, I gave up a little more space. My father's old mug disappeared from the kitchen shelf. The small photo of him with me at the harbor was moved to a drawer. Samantha began wearing my sweaters without asking. When one came back with a coffee stain, she shrugged and said, "You didn't wear it anyway." I started spending evenings walking by the shore just to breathe air that wasn't theirs. The house behind me glowed warm in the distance, but it didn't feel like home anymore. One night I stopped by the fence and looked up at the light in the attic window. My father used to call it the eye of the house. He said it watched over us. Now it felt like it was watching me disappear. I thought about packing a bag, driving away, finding some small apartment inland. But then I looked back at the sea, dark and endless, and I heard his voice again, soft, patient, unbending. "You don't leave what you've built. You protect it." So I went back inside. When I opened the door, the heat hit my face, and I heard Linda humming in the living room. On the table beside her was a box labeled "Donation." Inside were my father's books, the ones he signed, the ones that still smelled like sawdust and ink. "You're giving these away?" I asked quietly. She looked up, her tone light but sharp beneath the sweetness. "They're old Clara. Dust collectors. Let's make space for new things." My throat tightened. "They're not just books." "Everything has its time," she said, and turned back to her tea. I picked up one of the books and held it for a long moment, tracing my father's initials on the inside cover. I should have fought for it then. I should have told her no, but I didn't. I put it down gently like saying goodbye and walked to my room. The walls seemed to echo that night. Every sound felt louder, the tick of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, the faint crash of waves outside. When I lay down, I could feel tears pressing at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. There was a strange strength in staying still, in not giving them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I whispered into the dark. Sometimes silence feels safer than truth, but deep down, I knew it was only buying time. The morning it happened, the wind had a sharper edge than usual. It came off the Atlantic in long, bitter gusts that rattled the windows and carried the faint smell of salt and frozen pine. I had been up since dawn finishing a contract for a client in Portland. The house was quiet, except for the hum of my laptop and the steady tick of the clock in the hall. When I hit send, a small satisfaction passed through me. For once, something in my life felt like it still belonged to me. I stood stretched and walked toward the kitchen. The air was cold enough that my breath fogged near the window. I opened the fridge and reached for the cake I'd bought the night before, a small vanilla one with white frosting and a gold ribbon around the box. I'd told myself it was just dessert, but in truth, it marked a year since my father's passing. A quiet ritual, nothing grand. I cut a thin slice, the knife pressing through the soft icing, and let the smell of vanilla and sugar fill the room. Then I heard footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful. "See?" Samantha's voice cut through the hum of the refrigerator. "She always eats other people's stuff." I turned, startled. She was standing there with her phone raised, live stream already rolling, her tone bright and fake for the camera. "Caught her again," she said, flashing a grin that never reached her eyes. "Can you believe this?" For a moment, I didn't understand what she was doing. The phone's red recording light glowed like an accusation. I set down the knife carefully. "This isn't yours, Sam. I bought it yesterday." "Oh, really?" she said, stepping closer. "You didn't ask. Everything in this house is shared. Or maybe you forgot. It's not really your house anymore, is it?" The words struck harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't have time to form. Her hand came out of nowhere, a flash of movement, a crack of skin meeting skin. The sound was sharp, slicing through the cold air like a whip. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. My cheek stung. The heat spread in a perfect outline of her fingers. The smell of vanilla turned heavy, almost sour, as my pulse surged in my ears. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, unsteady, and strange. The slice of cake slipped from the plate and fell onto the tiled floor, frosting smearing like a pale wound. The phone camera caught everything. She didn't even lower it. She was still smiling, still performing. "Now you'll have something sweet to cry over," she said, her voice almost gleeful. My vision blurred for half a second, not from tears, but from disbelief. I'd seen cruelty before, but never so public, so deliberate. Then, from the hallway, came the slow shuffle of slippers. Linda appeared wrapped in her robe, her expression unreadable. She looked at me, then at the cake on the floor, then at Samantha, who held the phone like a weapon. "What happened here?" she asked mildly, as if she hadn't seen everything. "She's stealing food again," Samantha said quickly. "I told her to stop." Linda nodded, once her gaze settling on me like frost forming on glass. Her voice was calm, but cold enough to cut. "Greedy girls end up alone." The words floated through the room like smoke, quiet but poisonous. They didn't need to be shouted. They carried every insult left unsaid for months. My cheek throbbed. I could feel the shape of Samantha's hand burning there, and behind it, the echo of my father's absence, the silence of a house turned against me. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to make them see how wrong it was. But instead, I stood very still. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the fridge faded. The sound of the ocean outside replaced everything else. I watched a crumb of cake roll across the tile, a ridiculous detail that somehow made the whole thing feel real. My fingers twitched, but I didn't move. Inside me, something shifted quietly, like a door unlocking. I looked at Linda and saw no trace of the woman my father had once loved. Only calculation. I looked at Samantha and saw a mirror of that cruelty, younger, sharper, louder. I thought of my father's words, "You'll make this place your own someday," and realized that moment had finally come, though not in the way I imagined. I turned slowly, feeling the sting of the slap cool under the draft from the window. My hand brushed the doorknob. It was cold, smooth grounding. I opened the door halfway and let the wind pour in. The curtains lifted, the papers on the counter fluttered. Samantha's phone wobbled in her grip, the camera shaking. Linda's eyes narrowed. I could hear my heart beat again, slower now, stronger. "Then you can both start learning what alone really feels like," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It came out steady, almost too calm. They froze. For the first time, I saw fear, not the kind born from danger, but from realization. They knew I meant it. I didn't slam the door or raise my voice. I just let the cold air sweep through the kitchen until it carried away the smell of vanilla and the sound of pretense. The phone's red light flickered once and went dark. Linda turned away, first muttering something about ungratefulness. Samantha followed, her laughter forced, now thin and hollow. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence was deafening. I stood there, the wind gone, the ocean roaring faintly in the distance. The cake lay ruined on the floor, but I didn't pick it up. Some messes aren't meant to be cleaned right away. They're meant to remind you that something has changed forever. For a few seconds after the words left my mouth, the only sound was the wind pressing against the window panes. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, like the air itself was watching to see what I'd do next. Linda tilted her head, almost amused. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice slow and patronizing. Samantha let out a small scoff, crossing her arms. "You're seriously losing it," she muttered. I took one step forward, the floor creaking beneath me. My cheek still burned from the slap, but the pain had sharpened into focus. I spoke quietly, each word like a nail finding its place. "This is my house," I said. "My fridge. My cake." Linda's smile spread brittle and cold. "Your name may be on the deed," she said, "but your soul isn't." She said it like she believed it, like ownership of my father's memory gave her claim to everything he'd ever touched. For a moment, I almost laughed. The absurdity of it all, two women living off my patience and still daring to talk about souls. I looked at them both, really looked. Linda with her silk robe and that practiced calm she wore like armor. Samantha standing half a step behind her eyes, darting between me and her phone, waiting for another scene to film. I realized then that I had been living with ghosts, loud ones, cruel ones, but ghosts nonetheless. And I was the only one left who could close the door. I walked past them slow, deliberate. Each step echoed through the house. At the front door, I reached for the coat rack and took down my father's old keyring. The brass key to the house was still there, cool and heavy. My fingers wrapped around it, and I felt the same steadiness he once carried when everything else fell apart. I unlocked the door. The sound of the latch was loud enough to make Samantha flinch. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and seaweed. It whipped through the hallway, lifting the edge of the curtains and blowing Linda's hair back. She blinked, startled, and for the first time, her calm slipped. I turned to face them, the wind pulling strands of my hair across my face. "Then you can both start learning what alone really feels like," I said. The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They landed with the weight of truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Linda's lips parted as if she might protest, but nothing came out. Samantha started to raise her phone again, the lens trembling slightly. "Oh, I'm definitely recording this," she said, her voice shaky with defiance. I nodded. "Good," I said evenly. "Make sure you record the truth for once." She froze her thumb, hovering over the screen. Something in my tone must have reached her, because for the first time, she lowered the phone. The silence between us stretched thin, broken only by the wind whistling through the open doorway. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the hall. "Your bags are ready." Linda frowned, confusion flickering before realization dawned. She turned her head slowly toward the staircase. There by the bottom step sat two suitcases, hers and Samantha's. I had packed them a week earlier. Some part of me must have known this moment would come. Linda's voice cracked for the first time. You went through my things." I didn't answer. I simply met her eyes. There was no anger left, just a calm so deep it frightened her. "You can't just," she started. "I can," I said, "and I am." Samantha stepped forward, her face twisted with disbelief. "You're insane," she said. "You'll regret this when you're all alone in this creepy house." I looked past her toward the photo of my father on the wall. "I already know what alone feels like," I said softly. "But at least now it'll be honest." Linda moved closer, lowering her voice, trying one last time to reclaim authority. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you'll see. The world doesn't reward cruelty." I gave a small humorless smile. "No," I said, "but it punishes hypocrisy." The wind gusted again, louder this time, rattling the glass panes. I opened the door wider. Outside, the rain had started soft and cold. It fell in thin silver threads that caught the morning light. "Go," I said simply. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Samantha grabbed her suitcase, muttering curses under her breath. Linda followed, clutching her coat around her shoulders. At the threshold, she turned back. "Your father would be ashamed," she said. I took a breath and stepped closer. He'd be ashamed it took me this long. That ended it. They stepped out into the rain. I watched them walk down the gravel path, their figures growing smaller until the fog began to swallow them. The sound of the rain hitting the porch was steady, rhythmic, almost like applause from the sea. I closed the door slowly. The latch clicked into place, and the house fell silent again. Not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned. I leaned against the door for a long moment, letting the cold seep into my palms. The smell of vanilla still lingered faintly in the air, but it didn't make me ache anymore. It smelled like closure. I walked back through the house, past the kitchen, past the mess of crumbs and frosting on the floor. I didn't clean it. Not yet. Instead, I went to the living room, stood before my father's photo, and whispered, "It's done." My voice barely carried above the rain, but somehow it felt like he heard me. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The storm outside had only just begun, but inside everything felt still. I sat on the couch and watched the rain beat on the window, tracing long trails down the glass. The wind howled and the sea answered. I didn't feel small anymore. I felt steady. That's the thing about breaking points, they're not always loud. Sometimes they arrive with a whisper and a door that finally opens. If you had been standing where I was with the rain pouring and your heart finally steady, would you have done the same or stayed silent one more time? Tell me below. 3 days after they left, the first echo reached me through a phone notification. It was a Facebook post from Linda. The photo showed her standing in front of a diner somewhere off Route 1, wrapped in a plaid scarf, holding a cup of coffee as if she were braving the elements with grace. The caption read, "She kicked her mother out in winter. Some hearts are colder than snow." The post had already gathered nearly 200 likes and a flood of comments. How could she do that to you? Unbelievable. Family means forgiveness. I stared at the screen for a moment, the glow of it reflecting against the window. Outside, the sea was a sheet of dull gray. I set my phone face down and went back to my work. But the silence didn't last. Camden was a small town, the kind where stories moved faster than the tide. By the next afternoon, people I barely knew were stopping me in the grocery store. "Hey, Clara," one woman said near the produce aisle. "I saw something online. Is everything okay at home?" Her voice carried the false softness of curiosity, pretending to be concern. I smiled politely, adjusting the strap of my basket. "Everything's fine," I said, and walked away. At the cafe, someone at the counter whispered my name, followed by the word cold-hearted. By Thursday, even my manager from the design firm in Portland called during a meeting. "Clara," he said gently, "I've had a few clients ask if you're dealing with family issues. Should I be worried?" I took a slow breath. "No, Sam, you shouldn't be." He hesitated, then sighed. "You know how small towns get." "Yes," I said, "I do." When I hung up, I sat for a long while looking out at the frost clinging to the windows. It amazed me how quickly lies could travel when dressed as sympathy. That weekend, I drove to the local market to pick up soil and bulbs for the small garden by the porch. It was something my father used to do every spring. As I loaded the car, I saw Mrs. Peters, my elderly neighbor, walking by with her dog. She stopped, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. "You holding up all right, dear?" she asked. Her tone wasn't pitying, just curious, grounded. I nodded. "I'm fine. Just keeping busy." She glanced toward the house, then back at me. "People talk," she said, her gray eyes soft but steady. "The truth walks. Let it." Then she gave a small nod, as if that was all that needed to be said, and kept walking. Her words stayed with me all day. That night, I stood in front of the fireplace, looking at the framed photograph of my father in his Coast Guard uniform. His eyes were bright, his smile proud but gentle. The photo had a faint crack across the glass, one I'd never fixed. I traced it with my finger, following the line from corner to corner. "I didn't lose them," I whispered. "I just stopped losing myself." Saying it out loud felt like letting go of a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. But outside, the storm of whispers continued. Linda's post turned into screenshots. Screenshots turned into threads on local community pages. People debated whether I had the right to evict her. Some called me heartless. Others said there must have been more to the story. only a few said what mattered. It's her house. One evening, as I walked through town to pick up groceries, I could feel the weight of eyes on me. A group of women near the bakery fell silent as I passed. Someone muttered, "That's her." It didn't sting the way I thought it would. There was almost a strange peace in knowing who I was without having to explain it anymore. The following morning, I decided to reclaim my silence on my own terms. I turned off my phone, shut down my laptop after work, and went outside. The air smelled of thawing snow and pine. I cleared the garden bed near the porch, digging through the frozen earth until my fingers ached. I planted bulbs, daffodils, tulips, lilies, small promises to myself that life would bloom again, no matter how harsh the season. The act of planting something in the cold was both defiance and hope. As the days passed, the noise from town began to dull. Linda had moved in temporarily with a cousin in Rockland. Samantha, according to one post I stumbled upon before deleting my social apps, had started a healing vlog about toxic family experiences. The irony was almost poetic. She posed in front of a fireplace that wasn't hers, tears glistening in perfect lighting. Sometimes, she said in one clip, you just have to leave behind people who don't appreciate your energy. The comments praised her strength. I closed the tab without finishing it. Some truths don't need defending, they outlive the lies on their own. One afternoon, while I was pruning dead branches in the yard, the mailman pulled up and handed me a thick envelope. "Looks official," he said. The sender was Linda. Inside was a typed letter filled with legal jargon, her intent to reclaim shared property. It listed several items: the armchair she'd sold, the books she'd donated, even the curtains she'd installed. My lawyer friend in Portland took one look and laughed. "She can't claim what she already gave away," he said. I thanked him and filed the letter under unresolved nonsense. It went to the bottom of the drawer. Evenings grew longer. I spent them sitting by the window, watching the light fade over the harbor. Sometimes I saw neighbors walking their dogs, others driving past, slowly pretending not to look. The gossip had become background noise, fading like radio static. What replaced it was something quieter, steadier. My routine returned. Work tea tending to the house. I patched the porch railing myself, repainted the front door navy blue, the color my father had chosen years ago. One Sunday morning, while buying coffee at Baylight Cafe, I overheard two women at the counter. "Did you hear about Linda?" one whispered. "Her cousin kicked her out. Something about unpaid rent." The other shook her head. "Guess karma doesn't freeze in winter." They both laughed softly. I didn't join them, but I didn't need to. The world has its way of balancing stories. When I got home, I sat in the garden and watched the first shoots of green pushing through the soil. The air was still cold, but the ground had begun to soften. I thought of my father again, how he used to say, "Winter always lies about being the end." I smiled. That night, I lit a single candle by the window, not for mourning, but for peace. The flame, flickered steady and small, reflected in the glass beside his photograph. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched by anyone's judgment. The gossip had burned itself out like fire, starved of air. The next morning, I opened the front door and breathed in the sea air. The world outside hadn't changed. The gulls still cried over the harbor, the waves still broke against the rocks, but inside me, everything had shifted. I wasn't the woman they talked about online anymore. I wasn't the quiet stepdaughter or the tenant or the help. I was just Clara Monroe, standing in her father's house, holding her own peace. The truth had walked, just like Mrs. Peters said. It didn't need to shout. It only needed to arrive steady and undeniable. The afternoon was colder than usual, with the kind of gray sky that warned of snow, but never delivered it. I hadn't planned to stop by Baylight Cafe that day, but my hands were stiff from the garden work, and I needed warmth, something simple like coffee and quiet. The cafe sat at the corner of Bay Street facing the harbor. Its windows were fogged from the heat inside, and when I pushed open the door, the little bell above it chimed, carrying a sound that felt like an old memory. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air. I brushed snow from my coat and looked around for an empty table. Then I saw them. Linda and Samantha sitting near the back with 3 other women from town, their laughter loud and sharp enough to cut through the hum of the cafe. Linda's voice carried across the room, clear, practiced, performative. Ungrateful brat, she said loud enough for half the cafe to hear. Kicked her stepmother into the cold after all I did for her. Samantha leaned closer, her tone even crueler. You know what's funny? She acts like she's so independent, but that house, everything she owns, came from Dad's money. She should be thanking us. The other women tittered nervously, unsure whether to agree or stay quiet. My pulse didn't quicken. It just slowed steady and measured. I'd spent weeks listening to whispers. Hearing them say it to my face was almost a relief. I walked to the counter, ordered black coffee, and took the seat closest to the window. The view outside showed the harbor glazed in ice and a gull perched on the dock post unmoving. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting their words float behind me like static. But then I heard a familiar voice from across the room. Linda said the cafe owner, his tone even but edged. Mason Turner, my father's old friend. He'd served with him years ago and after retirement opened Baylight Cafe with the same discipline he once gave to the sea. He was wiping down the counter, his eyes never leaving Linda's table. Didn't Clara pay the property tax for you last spring? The entire cafe seemed to stop breathing. The sound of spoons against mugs went silent. Linda blinked, her mouth half open. What are you talking about? She said, a touch of panic sneaking into her voice. Mason leaned his elbows on the counter. I remember because I was there when she came in asking me how to fill out the form. Said you didn't have the money that month. She even covered your electric bill, didn't she? The women at the table shifted uneasily. Samantha's cheeks flushed a shade darker. Linda's lips parted again, searching for something to say. That's... She started, but the words tangled. That's not the point. She threw us out like animals. Mason straightened, folding his towel neatly. No, he said. She asked you to leave the house her father built. That's not cruelty. That's boundary. A heavy silence fell across the room. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, though I hadn't said a word. I took one slow sip of coffee, then set the cup down. The heat of it grounded me. Then, without thinking too much, I reached into my bag. My fingers brushed against the manila envelope I had been carrying for weeks, documents I'd kept not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Maybe I had always known this moment would come. I stood the legs of the chair scraping lightly against the floor and walked toward their table. The sound of my boots on the old wooden floor echoed louder than I expected. I stopped a few feet away. Linda's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough for me to hear it. I didn't answer right away. I placed the envelope on the table, the flap slightly open. "Since we're discussing the truth," I said softly, "let's let it speak for itself." Slowly, I slid the contents across the table. Printed receipts, utility bills, tax records, transfer slips. The papers spread out, covering the surface like a timeline of generosity gone unnoticed. "These are the property taxes," I said, pointing to the first stack. "Paid March 14th with my signature. This one's your heating bill from last December. Remember when the pipes froze, paid in full by me. The grocery deliveries every week charged to my account. The insurance premiums, also me." I lifted my gaze to meet hers. "Everything you said I took from you was already something I gave." Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Samantha fumbled with her phone as if looking for somewhere to hide behind the screen. The women beside them sat frozen eyes darting between me and the papers. Mason crossed his arms behind the counter, silent witness to everything. The hum of the espresso machine filled the room again, soft and distant. "You think money proves anything," Linda finally said, her voice cracking. "You're cold, Clara. You have no heart." I nodded once. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I used to think heart meant letting people hurt me without consequence. Now I know it means protecting what's mine." I gathered the last page, a handwritten note from my father dated 2 years before his death. "If you ever feel the house turning against you, remember, you own the foundation. They can change the walls, but not the ground beneath it." I placed it gently on top of the pile. "I don't need to defend myself," I said, stepping back. "The receipts already did." The words came out calm, not triumphant. Just true. Linda looked down at the papers, her fingers trembling. The lines around her eyes deepened. Samantha shifted in her seat, her face pale, her phone now face down on the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cafe's clock ticked, and the wind outside howled faintly against the glass. Then quietly, one of the women at Linda's table whispered, "I didn't know." No one replied. Linda's shoulders slumped. Her composure cracked just slightly enough for the truth to slip through. "You think you're better than me?" she said weakly. "You always did." I met her gaze and shook my head. "No, I just stopped pretending you were." I turned to leave, but Mason's voice stopped me. "Clara," he said, his tone gentle, "you forgot this." I turned back to see him holding one of the papers I'd left behind. I smiled faintly. "Keep it," I said. "Maybe it'll remind people what really happened." I walked toward the door. The air inside had turned thick, heavy with the weight of what couldn't be unsaid. As I passed the counter, I heard a chair scrape behind me. Samantha was standing now, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes, not from guilt, but humiliation. "You didn't have to do that," she hissed, her voice barely audible. I paused my hand on the door handle. "Neither did you," I said. "But here we are." I pushed open the door, the bell chiming again. The cold air hit my face sharp and cleansing. Behind me, I heard chairs shift. Murmurs start up again, quieter this time, different in tone. I stepped outside into the gray light. The sea breeze carried the faint smell of coffee and salt, the two scents blending like memory and release. I walked down Bay Street without looking back. For once, I didn't care who was watching. Every step away from that cafe felt lighter, freer. When I reached the edge of the dock, I turned toward the water. The tide was low, the rocks glistening. The gull from earlier still sat on the post, unmoved, steady. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. For months, I had thought silence meant weakness, that not defending myself was the only way to stay dignified. But standing in that cafe, watching the truth unfold in front of everyone, I realized silence isn't weakness. It's proof. Proof that patience has an ending, that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, and that sometimes justice doesn't wear anger, it wears calm. After that day at the cafe, the silence of Camden changed. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet that used to fill my house. It was different, brighter somehow, like the air after a storm when everything smells clean and new. But for Linda, that silence was heavier than thunder. By the following week, her world began to shrink. The first sign came from the church bulletin. Someone told me her name had been quietly removed from the volunteer committee she'd run for years. The pastor hadn't called it punishment, just a time for reflection. In small towns, that phrase meant exile. Then the whispers began to reverse course. The same people who had pitied her started asking quiet questions. Didn't Clara pay their bills? Didn't Linda sell the father's things? It spread in murmurs through grocery aisles and along the docks. Even the hair salon stopped gossiping in her favor. The story she had written online began to crumble under its own exaggeration. When lies lose their echo, they sound like truth dying. I didn't post anything in response. I didn't need to. My life stayed steady, work in the morning's garden, in the afternoon's tea, by the window at night. Samantha was the next to fall. One Friday morning, I walked past the flower shop on Main Street and saw her boss, Irene, flipping the sign to closed. She recognized me and gave a small, knowing nod. "She's not with us anymore," she said. "Customers didn't want the drama." I thanked her without asking for details. Some lessons write themselves. A few days later, I saw Samantha's car parked outside the diner windows, fogged her silhouette, slumped forward against the steering wheel. I didn't approach. There was nothing left to say. She had chosen spectacle over sincerity, and now she was living inside the echo of her own performance. The irony of it all would have made her laugh once. Now it only made her hide. Linda, meanwhile, had returned to her cousin's house in Rockland. At first, she tried to rebuild her reputation with charity posts online, photos of her handing out blankets to the homeless, captions full of Bible verses about forgiveness. But people could feel the shift. There was something hollow in her tone, a rehearsed gentleness that no longer fooled anyone. Eventually, her cousin, tired of the attention, asked her to leave. Word traveled fast. "She's renting a room near the pier, Mrs. Peters told me one morning as we both stood by our mailboxes. A small one above that old bait shop. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact, like reporting the weather. I nodded. Everyone finds their own tide eventually, I said. She smiled faintly. Some just get swept out first. Weeks passed, and the town returned to its rhythm. The fishermen set out before dawn, the kids biked down Bay Street after school, and the smell of salt and diesel filled the air again. My garden began to bloom early that spring, the bulbs I'd planted pushing through, frosted their colors defying the cold. I spent hours outside pruning, watering, letting my hands find peace in the soil. Some evenings I'd sit on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, listening to the gulls and thinking about how quiet survival could feel. There were no apologies, no grand confrontations, just stillness and the slow undoing of everything false. Every now and then, someone would stop by to say something kind. The cashier at the market told me she admired my composure. The mailman said he'd seen worse storms take longer to clear. Even Mason from the cafe came by once to drop off a small brown bag. Inside was a free coffee card and a note that simply said, "Truth served hot." I smiled at that. It was the kind of kindness that didn't need explaining, but the quiet victory didn't erase everything. Some nights when the wind picked up and rattled the windows, I'd wake and half expect to hear their voices again, the sharp laugh, the soft accusation, the click of Linda's slippers on the hardwood floor. Trauma doesn't leave all at once. It lingers like salt on skin. I learned to let it pass without fighting it. Instead, I'd get up, make tea, and sit by the window watching the waves shimmer under the moonlight. The ocean became my clock, steady and indifferent, reminding me that everything eventually finds its own horizon. About a month later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a note written in a familiar looping script. "I'm sorry you felt you had to embarrass me in front of everyone. I was only trying to keep the family together." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. I folded it once, then again, and placed it in the drawer with my father's letters. Not out of sentimentality, but closure. I didn't need to respond. Silence, after all, had become my language of truth. Spring came early that year, but Linda's luck froze. Her social media disappeared first, deactivated after too many comments asking about the cafe incident. Then, the church rescinded her request to teach Sunday classes. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd started drinking in the evenings, sitting alone at the pier. It wasn't revenge I felt when I heard it. It was something quieter, almost pity. People destroy themselves when they can't face their own reflection. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hydrangeas by the porch, Mrs. Peters stopped again on her walk. "I saw Linda yesterday," she said softly. Didn't recognize her at first. She looked smaller. I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Some storms destroy," I said, glancing toward the sea. "Some cleanse." Mrs. Peters tilted her head. "And this one," I smiled faintly. "A bit of both." That night, the waves were loud, crashing against the rocks with a rhythm that felt deliberate. I left the windows open to let the sound in. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. The furniture still carried faint traces of the past, but none of it hurt anymore. I'd learned that peace isn't the absence of noise. It's knowing which sounds to let stay. Before bed, I sat in my father's old chair, the one I'd bought back from a second-hand shop after learning Linda had sold it. It was scuffed and uneven, but it was home. I ran my fingers along the armrest where the varnish had worn away and closed my eyes. "You'd tell me to be kind," I murmured. "But you'd also tell me to stand tall." Outside, a gust of wind swept against the house, followed by the steady crash of the waves. They sounded less like reminders and more like applause. In the weeks that followed, my life grew simpler. The garden thrived, my work flourished. New clients came in through word of mouth, people drawn to the calm I had rebuilt. I started donating a portion of my earnings each month to a local shelter that helped victims of domestic and emotional abuse. It wasn't out of guilt, it was gratitude. Not everyone gets a second chance to reclaim peace. I didn't attend community events often, but when I did, people treated me differently, not as a victim, not as gossip, but as someone who had survived without bitterness. That was the quietest kind of victory. One afternoon in May, I walked along the harbor path and saw Samantha sitting alone on a bench. She looked thin or tired, her hair pulled back hastily. For a second, our eyes met. She looked away first. I almost felt a flicker of the old ache, the urge to comfort, to offer understanding. But then I remembered the sting of that slap, the smirk behind the phone, and the months of silence that followed. I nodded once in acknowledgement, a small act of grace, then kept walking. Some distances are worth preserving. As the sun dipped low, turning the water gold, I thought of all the noise that used to surround me. The lies, the gossip, the endless explanations. None of it mattered now. The truth had outlived them all, not through anger, but endurance. The sea roared again, distant but steady. I stood there until the light faded and the sky turned to steel. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I was simply living. When I returned home, I lit a candle on the windowsill and sat quietly as the house filled with its soft glow. I thought about Linda somewhere in that small rented room above the pier, listening to the same waves but hearing a different song. Regret has its own sound and it doesn't fade easily. Mine had turned into peace, hers into echo. As the candle burned lower, I whispered the words that had followed me since that night in the kitchen. Some storms destroy, some cleanse. The wind outside answered like agreement, brushing softly against the glass. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the silence finally rest. It was late February when the snow finally came down hard, thick enough to mute the sound of the sea. The flakes swirled like ash over the harbor, coating the porches and boats in quiet white. I had just finished shutting the windows against the cold and was sitting by the fire with a book when I heard a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Not frantic, not hesitant, but purposeful. I set the book down and waited, half expecting it to be the wind. But the knock came again, sharper this time. I stood, walked to the door, and looked through the small glass pane. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Linda stood on the porch, hunched under the weight of the snow, her coat torn at the sleeve hair, matted and streaked with melting frost. The porch light caught her face, pale and raw from the cold. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, were rimmed red as if she hadn't slept in days. I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob, the warmth of the fire still clinging to my skin. "Clara," she said, her voice muffled through the door. "Please, just a few days, until I find somewhere else." For a long moment, I said nothing. The snow kept falling behind her, coating the steps clinging to her shoulders. "You shouldn't be out in this weather." I finally said, my tone even. She exhaled a shaky breath, maybe thinking it was an invitation. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quickly. "My cousin. She doesn't want me there anymore. People won't speak to me. I've been looking for work, but—" Her words caught in her throat. "Please, Clara. Just a few days." I opened the door halfway, letting the wind sweep in. The cold cut between us like glass. She flinched. Up close, she looked smaller, almost fragile. For a brief second, pity flickered somewhere deep inside me. But then I remembered the kitchen, the slap, the live stream, the voice that said, "Greedy girls end up alone." I met her eyes. "Greedy girls end up alone," I said quietly, the words falling heavy between us. Her lips parted, trembling. "You don't have to." "I remember," I interrupted. "Do you?" Her chin quivered. The snow began to pile at her feet, her shoes soaked through. "I didn't mean it," she said, voice breaking. I was angry, confused. Everything went wrong after that. I've lost everything, Clara. Samantha. She stopped herself, then took a breath. Samantha left. She won't answer my calls. I don't even know where she is. You were right about her. About everything. I watched her carefully. The desperation was real, but underneath it I could still sense the remnants of manipulation, the tone she used when she wanted control. "You taught her well," I said. My voice low, steady. Her shoulders sagged as if the weight of that truth had finally crushed what was left of her pride. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should never have said those things. I should never have treated you like that. Your father, he'd hate what I've become." Her words drifted into the air like smoke, thin and disappearing. I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me did. But forgiveness wasn't a door you opened just because someone knocked in the snow. It was a long walk they had to take on their own. I shook my head slowly. "You made your choices," I said. "And now you're living with them. That's not punishment, Linda. That's life. She stepped forward slightly, her hand gripping the door frame. Please, she said again, almost whispering now. I don't need much, just a couch, just until the storm passes. The wind howled through the open space, scattering snow across the entryway. I felt it bite at my bare ankles. You should go, I said softly. There's a shelter in Rockland. They take people in during storms. Her eyes filled with tears. You're really turning me away, she asked. After everything. I met her gaze unflinching. After everything? I repeated. For a second, anger flashed in her expression. Quick, instinctive, the old Linda surfacing, but it faded just as fast, replaced by something hollow. You'll regret this, she whispered, though even she didn't sound convinced. No, I said. I already did, once. I closed the door slowly, not slamming it, just letting it shut with finality. The latch clicked. On the other side, I heard her sob once, a sound caught between shame and disbelief. Then silence. Through the frosted glass, I could see her standing there for a moment longer, snow gathering on her hair and shoulders. Finally, she turned and walked down the path, her figure swallowed by the white blur of the storm. I stayed by the door long after she was gone, listening to the muffled crunch of her footsteps fade into nothing. The fire crackled behind me, the only warmth left in the house. I leaned against the wall, my breath slow, my hands steady. The wind outside roared, but inside, everything was still. I thought of my father again, how he'd taught me that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Tonight, I finally understood what he meant. I walked to the window and looked out toward the road. The snow was falling harder now, erasing her tracks within minutes. Somewhere out there she would find shelter or she wouldn't. That was no longer mine to carry. I turned off the porch light and sat back by the fire, the glow casting long shadows across the room. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just peace. Justice when quiet feels a lot like that. The clock ticked softly. Outside, the storm howled relentless but cleansing. And as the snow buried the past 1 inch at a time, I whispered to the silence. You said greedy girls end up alone. You were right. When the last of the snow melted, Camden began to breathe again. The streets glistened under the pale sunlight of early March, and the sea once locked in gray ice moved freely once more. The air smelled of salt and cedar, and for the first time in months, I opened every window in the house. The cold rushed in clean and alive, sweeping away the stale scent of winter. I spent the following days repainting the walls soft cream for the living room, pale blue. For the hallway, the color my father had once said reminded him of calm waters. With every brush stroke, it felt as if I was painting over ghosts sealing in the noise of the past beneath layers of quiet. I replaced the curtains Linda had chosen, those heavy floral ones that suffocated the light, with sheer linen that let the morning sun spill through like forgiveness. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt awake. Outside, the garden thawed under my hands. I cleared the soil, pruned the frostbitten stems, and planted a young red maple near the porch, the same spot where my father used to sit every morning with his newspaper and coffee. He'd said the view from there was the best in town because you could see both the sea and the sky at once. I wanted something to grow there, something steady and alive. As I pressed the roots into the earth, I whispered, "This one's for you, Dad." The wind carried the scent of soil and salt, and I swore I could almost hear his laugh again, soft and approving. The town had grown quiet about me. The whispers had faded, replaced by nods of acknowledgement when I passed by. Some people still looked away, maybe out of guilt for believing Linda's stories, but most simply smiled. Mason waved from the cafe window every morning, holding up a mug as if toasting to peace. Even Mrs. Peters, with her dog trotting faithfully beside her, would stop by the fence to chat about the weather or the garden. Camden was healing too, one small kindness at a time. Inside, the rhythm of my life returned. I'd wake early, brew tea in my father's old chipped mug, and stand by the window overlooking the bay. The mornings were my favorite when the mist hung low over the water and the gulls traced white arcs across the sky. The world felt suspended in that hour, caught between memory and renewal. One morning, as I held the warm cup between my hands, I said quietly to myself, "Peace doesn't come when people change. It comes when you do." I hadn't planned the words, but they fit. I finally understood that forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's the door you open for yourself when you're ready to stop living in the ruins. As the days lengthened, the color returned to everything. The red maple began to bud, small green fingers unfurling toward the sun. The ocean shifted from dull silver to deep blue, and the waves broke softly against the rocks, each one leaving behind a little more light than before. I started painting again, not the walls this time, but canvases. Scenes of the harbor, the garden, the kitchen bathed in morning sun. Each brush stroke was slow, meditative, deliberate. Sometimes I'd stop and just listen the kettle whistling, the wind in the eaves, the steady heartbeat of the waves beyond the window. There was music in the ordinary again. One evening, I took a walk along the beach. The tide had pulled back, revealing a stretch of wet sand that mirrored the sky. The sunset painted everything in gold and rose, and for a moment it was hard to tell where the sea ended and the heavens began. I thought about Linda then, not with anger, not even pity, just acknowledgement. Somewhere out there, she was living with the consequences she'd built. I hoped she'd find peace too, even if it came in a different shape. Samantha crossed my mind as well, a faint echo of youth wasted on cruelty. I wished her clarity someday. That was all. I stayed until the last light sank below the horizon, the sea catching the final glint of the sun like a held breath. The world felt balanced again. I turned back toward the house, the windows glowing softly in the distance. From the path I could see the flicker of the fireplace through the glass, and the red maple standing tall beside the porch, its branches catching the first blush of spring. Inside, the air was warm. I set a kettle on the stove, pulled a blanket over my shoulders, and watched the fire dance. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered not as pain, but as proof. Proof that I had survived that endurance had been its own kind of justice. The house hummed with quiet, the kind that comes when every corner has finally been reclaimed. Outside, the last snowmelt trickled down the gutters, the sound soft and rhythmic like breathing. The ocean reflected the stars, now endless and calm, no longer the roaring beast it had been through winter. I smiled at the thought how even the sea forgives itself. Some days it rages, some days it rests, but it always returns to balance. I blew out the candle by the window and whispered a small prayer, not for the past, not even for the people who hurt me, but for the version of myself that had finally learned to let go. The house settled around me, old wood sighing as if content. Tomorrow would be another day, another sunrise over the harbor, another cup of tea, another brushstroke of quiet joy. And as the night folded over the town, I lay in bed listening to the waves. The same sound my father had once said reminded him that life always moves forward. He was right. The storm had come, the storm had gone, and what remained was not ruin but renewal. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, reflecting the soft gold of the early spring sun to come, and for the first time in years, I drifted to sleep without fear, only peace. It started with one post. A quiet morning in late March, sunlight slanting through the window, the smell of tea and salt air mingling in the room. I hadn't planned to write anything. The cursor blinked on the empty screen like a heartbeat waiting. The world outside was still the kind of stillness that follows both endings and beginnings. I thought about everything that had happened, the slap, the words, the exile, the silence, and how many people must be living through something similar, swallowing their truth because peace seemed safer than confrontation. So I began to type. For anyone who's ever been silenced by family, I wrote slowly. You're not wrong for saying enough. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop letting people hurt you and call it love. I stared at the words for a while before hitting post. It wasn't meant to be brave or profound. It was just truth, simple and bare. But by evening, the post had taken on a life of its own. Comments began to appear from strangers, women, men, young and old. Some shared stories that mirrored my stepfamily's betrayal, the quiet pain of being erased inside their own homes. Others simply wrote, "Thank you. I needed this today." One message caught me off guard. It was from a woman in her 60s who said she hadn't spoken to her daughter in 10 years because she'd chosen silence over confrontation. Your words made me realize that distance doesn't always mean hate, she wrote. Sometimes it's the only way to stay kind. I read it 3 times before replying. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's surrender. I hope you find your peace. That night, I sat by the fire scrolling through messages until my eyes blurred. I hadn't realized how many people carried invisible bruises from words said behind closed doors. The world was full of survivors who'd mistaken endurance for weakness just as I once had. Over the next few days, the post spread beyond Camden. Friends of friends shared it, then community pages picked it up, then advocacy groups. Mason showed me one morning on his phone, grinning as he poured coffee. "You're trending, Clara," he said. "Not bad for someone who never liked attention." I laughed, shaking my head. "I didn't want attention," I said. "I just wanted honesty." "Same thing these days," he replied. His words stayed with me. Maybe honesty was its own kind of rebellion in a world built on performance. The messages kept coming. Some from strangers who'd seen the cafe video, others who had never heard of me until the post. "Your story helped me leave," one wrote. "Your calm gave me courage," said another. I never felt like a hero reading them, just a witness. I hadn't fought a war, I'd simply stopped losing one quietly. A journalist from Portland emailed asking to interview me for a segment about emotional boundaries and toxic families. I declined politely. "The story isn't about me," I wrote back. "It's about everyone who thinks they're alone when they finally stand up." She understood and sent a kind note in return. By the end of the week, I turned off notifications and stepped outside. The red maple by the porch had begun to bloom, tiny leaves unfurling against the blue sky. I sat on the steps with a cup of tea and thought about the strange path that had led me here, from humiliation to stillness, from silence to voice. None of it had been easy, but it had been necessary. Growth always feels like breaking at first. Later that evening, as the sky turned to gold, I opened my laptop again to write a final post. It wasn't long, just a closing thought for everyone who had reached out. "Healing isn't linear," I typed. "Some days you'll forgive, some days you'll remember. Both are part of surviving. Justice isn't loud, it's quiet, and it lasts." I pressed send and closed the laptop. The ocean outside caught the last rays of sunlight, reflecting them like liquid fire. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of spring. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. My truth had already found its way into the world, carried by the same calm that had once been mistaken for weakness. Now it was my strength. I looked out toward the horizon, the water glowing softly, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Then I sat back, breathing in the quiet that no longer felt empty, only earned. If this story reminded you of your own silence, don't carry it alone. You're not the only one who's ever stared across a dinner table and realized that love can sometimes sound like control. You're not the only one who's been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to keep the peace at the cost of your own. Maybe your breaking point didn't come with a slap or a cruel sentence. Maybe it came with years of slow erosion, the kind that wears you down until you hardly recognize yourself. But somewhere deep inside, you knew what Clara knew, that silence might protect others, but it destroys you. Tonight, I want you to take a breath and remember this: standing up for yourself isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's not revenge when you draw a line. It's justice, the quiet kind that doesn't scream but still echoes for years. If this story touched you, if it pulled up memories you thought you'd buried, leave a comment below. Someone out there is scrolling through these words right now, looking for proof that they're not crazy, not cruel, not wrong for finally saying enough. Maybe your story will be the one that helps them stand. For everyone who's been told that strength must always be loud, remember the ocean roars only when it's angry. Most of the time, it's steady, deep, and unstoppable. Quiet strength lasts longer than noise ever could. And that's what these stories are about. Not revenge born of hate, but justice born of truth. If you've ever chosen peace after chaos, if you've ever found your own voice after years of being spoken over, you already know what real courage feels like. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with sleep that's finally dreamless, with mornings that don't hurt. So, if you believe in quiet justice and real strength, hit like, subscribe, and join me again tomorrow night. Every story here carries the same heartbeat: survival, truth, and peace earned the hard way. Somewhere between the waves of betrayal and the calm of redemption, we all find a little piece of ourselves. Until then, Take care of your silence, but never let it cage you. Sometimes the softest voices carry the loudest truths, and sometimes silence itself can roar.